Welcome to the fifth video in this series of Grammar with Clarity for Everyone. This lesson is going to talk about the difference between phrases and clauses in a way that will really help us connect with this. That's my goal. So you need your dark blue and your red blue colored pencils, a sharpened pencil, and one sheet of notebook paper, and that's all you need. All right, the first thing that we're going to do at the top of our sheet of notebook paper is put a number 5 to indicate the fifth lesson. And then we're going to go ahead and write the title, which is The Differences Between Clauses and Phrases. That's our title. Then we're going to flip our paper sideways. We're going to turn it landscape. And we're going to make a Venn diagram. So if you've never worked with a Venn diagram, I'm going to teach you how to do this. We want to try to get the maximum space. And a Venn diagram is essentially two big circles that overlap. So I'm going to start right here, not totally in the middle, kind of here. This will be the top of my first circle. And I'm going to make a big circle that covers over the halfway mark. And then I'm going to start here and I'm going to make another big circle. You know, it's never perfect. It's okay if you need to erase and adjust. You don't need a huge space in the middle. These three compartments do not need to be the same. This should be much smaller, in fact. These two should be about equal though. Maybe the one on the left can be a little bit bigger. Okay. So the first thing we want to do, we want to identify what's happening. So this is called a Venn diagram, okay, with two circles overlapping. And a Venn diagram, if you've not used one before, it's a really great tool to break down when you're trying to make a comparison or a contrast or both between two things. It's really great with two. If you wanted to do with three, you would just add a third circle and then you could identify where they overlap. I've done that before with my son. It's kind of fun. It's pretty detailed. Okay, so in the middle where they overlap, this is what these two have in common. So we're going to write in common right there, okay? Then on the left, we're going to head this as clauses, all right? And you guys are already experts on clauses. That's why I want to put that on the left. That's the only reason I'm putting clauses on the left. That we have done 2 lessons specifically about clauses, and I want that to jump right in front of your mind first, okay? Then we're going to come over here and we're going to write what is unique about a phrase. What makes something a phrase versus a clause, okay? Clauses and phrases. I needed to sharpen my pencil. If you need to sharpen yours, please do so, because we have a lot of writing to do here. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of what we'll be creating, just so that you have a sense of what we're doing here for visual, breaking things down, okay? So there are 3 broad bullet points for clauses. The first one, I'm going to do a bullet point here to break it down, is that a clause always has a subject and a predicate. And you remember that from the last lessons, right? Always has a subject plus a predicate. We know this. If we can pick that out, we know it's a clause, okay? Then we have 2 categories of clauses. The first one being the independent clause. Okay, and then we're going to come down, skip some space, and we're going to put our third bullet point. The second one being the dependent clause. Now, if you remember from our very last lesson, the next thing we're going to identify is a relative clause, but that's a type of dependent clause, so it's going to be a subset of this. But before we put anything specific about independent clause versus dependent clause, let's do our color coding real quick, okay? Because remember, color coding is helpful. It helps everything kind of jump out. So let me go over my bullet point. I'm gonna just, oops, I accidentally grabbed my purple. They look the same in the dark. Okay, dark blue. Go ahead and go over, bold. I probably should sharpen this. Okay, and then go over my red and go over this. Is this optional? Nope. If I do it, you do it. Okay. Just stop your video if you need. If I'm going too fast, just stop your video. But if I do it, you do it. Okay, so what do we know that what makes an independent clause distinct from a dependent clause? Well, it's really simple. It's independent. So it stands alone as a complete thought. So I'm going to do a subset, and instead of a bullet point, I'm going to use an asterisk here. And I'm going to write stands alone as a complete thought. Okay, that's how we know something is an independent clause. Well, what about a dependent clause? Well, a dependent clause, we're going to have two asterisks here. The first one, we're going to say does not form a complete thought. And again, all we're doing here is kind of regurgitating what we've already practiced, okay? Putting it into a Venn diagram. This is not new. New is going to be over here. So dependent clause, it does not form a complete thought. And the next asterisk is that it leaves you hanging or wondering. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and add our relative clause. So I'm going to put like an arrow right here just to kind of show that this is a subset. And this is where I'm going to write relative clause. And then, you know, just like we did before, we're going to give it its due. It's its own distinctive type of clause, but it is also technically a dependent clause. So we're going to go ahead and give it its red. Okay. And what are we going to say about relative clause that you know, to identify it as its unique self? Well, one thing we're going to say is that it is a type of dependent. And another thing that we're going to say is that it begins with a special word, right? Do you remember that from your notes? So it begins with, I'm going to just put a few of them. Who, comma, whom, comma, that, and then ETC. So that stands for etc. So there's a bunch more, right? But I ran out of space. So that's a reminder that it begins with one of those words, and we can flip back to our notes and pick them out really quick. So what do clauses and phrases have in common? Well, they're both groups of words. Okay. They both add information to a sentence. That's it. Well, guess what? That's a really big deal, because when we're trying to pick out from groups of words and identify what something is, it can be really hard to do if we can't determine whether something has a subject and a predicate, which is why I started this series of lessons with that lesson. Okay, that's super important to pull into everything. Everything kind of builds, like in math. Everything in grammar seems to build. Okay, let's go over here to phrases. Phrases, when we identify whether something is a clause or a phrase, is really easy. The tricky part of phrases, where people start to shut down and get frustrated and overwhelmed, is trying to determine what type of phrase something is, okay? That's not today's lesson. That's a lot. That's coming up next. But we're just going to identify, how do we determine whether something is a phrase versus a clause? Okay, so here are the things that we look at for phrases. There are three. One, we need to identify that it either does not have a subject, could, or, we're going to write or in the middle really big there with kind of like this weird triangle arrow thing, does not have a predicate, Or again, right in the middle there with that kind of weird, again, this is some note-taking stuff, right? To get this to jump out at you. Does not have either one. Okay. The last thing we're going to write on our notes, we're going to draw an arrow down here. And we're going to write many different types. And that's not for today's lesson. So wow, that seems really simplistic, doesn't it? So a clause always has a subject and it always has a predicate. A phrase is going to either be missing a subject or missing a predicate or missing both. And that, you guys, that's how we determine whether something is a phrase or a clause. Now, if it's a clause, we have pretty good criteria to determine whether it's an independent or a dependent, right? But if it's a phrase, that's where we become into a whole different set of rules. And that's where we talk about, well, what job does it do? So that is where we're moving into next, would be types of phrases. I hope this was helpful for you. I have found this particular lesson to be incredibly helpful for pretty much every student that I've worked with. So I hope that you found it helpful as well. The next step, of course, is to take what we just did in our learning and to apply it with IXL. So if you don't wait, if you take the learning and you do the immediate practice with IXL, you get immediate feedback, and then you can be very confident that you're like, oh yeah, I do have this. I understand this. Good for me, you know, pat on the back. Good job. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to be looking at in IXL related to determining if something is a phrase or a clause. Okay, so this example comes to us from the 12th grade, U.1. Is it a phrase or a clause? So the question says, is the group of words in bold a phrase or a clause? So first we want to go ahead and read the sentence and then we focus on what's in bold. Although glaciers occupy only about 10% of the Earth's land surface, they contain about 75% of its fresh water. The first thing we want to do is go back to our Venn diagram. We want to look at the left-hand side. The left-hand side has us checking, do we have a subject and a predicate? Okay, so let's look at the bolded words. They would be the subject, right? Contain is the action, it's the predicate. The rest of it's just extra cool information's the complete predicate, but they contain. So it has a subject, it has a verb. So based on that determination, it must be a clause. This is not asking you, is it an independent clause or a dependent clause? It's just saying, is it a clause or is it a phrase? Well, it has to be a clause because it has a subject and it has a verb. Okay, this next example also comes to us from the 12th grade, U.1. Same situation, it says, is the group of words in bold a phrase or a clause? So first we want to read the whole sentence. Although poisonous and potentially deadly, pufferfish are a delicacy in countries like Japan and China. All right, well, remember that first thing we want to do is look to see, does it have a subject and a predicate? In countries like Japan and China? Well, no, it doesn't. So we don't have either. It doesn't contain a predicate. So it cannot be a clause. It has to be a phrase. Okay. I don't know if we would no, in is not a verb. I'm sorry, in my notes, I should have said it doesn't contain a subject or a predicate because in is a preposition, not a verb. I missed that in my notes. I apologize. So this is an example of a phrase that doesn't contain a subject or a predicate, but it's good extra information. So it's not a bad thing to have, right? We want it to have it, but it's just, this helps us determine whether it's a phrase or a clause. In this case, definitely a phrase. What type of phrase? We're not there yet. I'll tell you it's a prepositional phrase, and that's because of the word in, but we're not there yet. That's next lesson. Okay, here is the path for the practice problems for IXL. I would like you to do 20 correct, please, not 10 at this point. If you're in 7th grade, you'll go to Z.1. 8th grade will be AA.1. 9th grade will be X.1. 10th, X.1. And 11th and 12th grade are both at U.1. So you're practicing just determining whether a group of words is considered a phrase or a clause. And actually, I wish I was sitting there next to you as you were picking them out and going, wow, look at me, I figured this out. It's pretty neat stuff to be able to sit there and watch a student go, okay, I get this, I can determine this now. So you're going to experience that, and good for you. I'm excited for you, and be prepared for what's coming up next, which is breaking down different types of phrases, determining what their job is, how do we pick them out from a sentence. We'll try to make it as engaging as possible. I might even probably break it into 2 separate videos as opposed to just one, because it would be a lot. It'll be a long one if I just do one. All right, everybody, signing off. Good job. Thank you for hanging in this far.